Good afternoon. Welcome to Medical Grand Rounds. I'm Bob Wachter, chair of the department. This week we celebrated International Women's Day, which gave us an opportunity to thank all of the women in our department and at UCSF for their extraordinary contributions. Women now make up more than 50% of our faculty and an even higher percentage of all of our people in the department. The day provides an opportunity and for us to think hard about some of the progress we've made in promoting gender equity in the workplace, as well as the many remaining challenges. This week, you may have seen that we released our report on the experience of female faculty in the Department of Medicine, and special thanks to Beth Harleman and Irma Malasarkar for putting together the report. I hope you'll take some time to read it. It's chock full of information, and it's, I think, quite well done and very useful. It demonstrates a lot of progress. One piece I'm particularly proud of is that women now hold 49% of the leadership positions in the department. That's associate and vice chairs and division chiefs. That's up from 30% 5 years ago. But the report also highlights the many hurdles and systemic problems that still need to be addressed, and some of them, in fact, many of them were amplified by our experience with COVID over the past 2 years. So I'm delighted today that we have three superb speakers with us to address various aspects of the experience of women in medicine and healthcare generally, and particularly here at UCSF, including some of the things that we're doing better and making progress on, but also the challenges. So let me introduce them to you. The format will be 3 individual talks, and then we'll bring all of them on at the end for Q&A. And if you have questions, please put them in the box at the bottom. The first speaker will be my good friend, Vinnie Arora. Vinnie is the Herbert Abelson Professor of Medicine and Dean for Medical Education at the University of Chicago Pritzker School of Medicine. As a Dean for Medical Education, a position she assumed, I guess, a year ago or so, or I'm trying to remember the time.
Less than a year, yeah.
Less than a year ago.
Yeah.
And might as well do it in the middle of a pandemic. She oversees graduate medical education, undergraduate medical education, CME, simulation, and probably about 10 more things I'm forgetting. Vinnie's a member of the National Academy of Medicine. She's an accomplished researcher whose work involves improving care and learning in teaching hospitals. She's been very well funded through her career. She's studied sleep, fatigue, handoffs, improving working conditions for trainees. She's long been an advocate for improving health equity and opportunity in academic medicine, and has been an influential voice nationally and internationally for women in medicine. So Vinnie, thanks so much for being with us. And I will also say she is a hospitalist. Irma Malasarkar is a professor of medicine, associate chair for the department for faculty experience. She's also associate director for the UCSF Center for Vulnerable Populations. She's a primary care doc at ZSFG. Her role as associate chair is encompasses faculty well-being and morale, faculty development, strategic initiatives, and a supporting role in the department's DEI work. She's principal investigator for UCSF's T32 training grant in primary care and a co-PI for our Learning Health System early career development program. She's an accomplished and well-known researcher in health equity with a particular focus in digital tools and social media platforms. And in that work, she co-founded UCSF Solve Health Tech, which helps digital health companies adapt and evaluate their products for marginalized populations. Irma Mala, thank you for being here. And last but not least, Diane Slipka is professor of medicine in the Division of Hospital Medicine at UCSF Health. And she is also the chief physician experience officer at UCSF Health. And in that role, she's led our provider experience efforts organizationally since 2014, has made a massive contribution. I can't tell you the number of times that something is broken and people say, let's ask Diane. So may have the hardest job in the organization. This role includes measurement of provider work experience, as well as individual, local, and organizational efforts to improve well-being and structural and systemic challenges for providers. She also co-chairs the UC-wide collaboration on physician well-being and leads UCSF's Health Center for Enhancement of Communication in Healthcare. Dan, thank you for being here. Let us turn first to Vinnie and to start things off. Vinnie, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me. It's great to be here, and especially celebrating Women's History Month, as well as the week of International Women's Day with all of you. I'm going to talk about women in medicine, sustaining and salvaging in a pandemic world. I did want to highlight before I get started that I will be using the terms male and female at times, but in all respects, I do know that there are more than two genders, and so I do want to acknowledge non-binary identities, and sometimes many of the studies did only use male and female gender, and so unfortunately, we hope to change that in the future. And so if we move on to the next slide, I did want to highlight, how did I get interested in this? As you heard Bob's introduction, I was, knee deep in, quality, safety, handoffs, and sleep. And so it turns out it was more of a personal calling, which is I was asked to review a paper by one of your faculty, Dr. Rita Redberg, for JAMA Internal Medicine. It was authored by 3 men, and it was looking at a pay gap in public academic medical centers, which they had salaries for because they're publicly available through FOIA request. And there was, lo and behold, a $20,000 pay gap between men and women in these academic medical centers faculty. And they did a great job of trying to control for so many different things, like the number of patients you see, or awards, whether you were a researcher, or what rank you were. And they were still left with that $20,000 pay gap. And so in the great methods section, read on to the discussion, and the discussion really boiled down to women should learn how to negotiate more. And so as somebody who is a mid-career myself, recognizing that I had thought of myself as a good negotiator, I realized that there was an opportunity to highlight so much more than just negotiation, things like structural issues like salary transparency, issues around women in leadership positions. And also this, as somebody who's been a trailing spouse for a big chunk of my career, one thing that I've been always enamored with is we always think of giving somebody a salary bonus when they threaten to leave. But what about a loyalty bonus? Many women actually are loyal to the places that they work because of stability for family reasons. And yet we spend a lot of time actually courting people who might not ever come here. And so when this paper was published, it turned out that the New York Times called, Catherine St. Louis called and said, hey, we'd like to run a story. And because you're the one woman with the editorial, we're going to actually feature you. And it actually ran with this headline, Dr. Paid Less. And so of everything I've ever done in my life, if you're in the New York Times with your picture, that's the thing you're known for. And so people all over the country were like, and world were like, oh my gosh, Vinny, Dr. Paid Less, you're actually the spokesperson now for the pay equity gap. And so and lo and behold, it became me. And so the group that I actually am referring to is a group based out of Harvard, and Anupam Jena, Bapu Jena is actually one of our former alums who is a big member of this group. And actually they've gone on to do amazing work looking at outcomes for male and female physicians, showing that female physicians actually have better outcomes with respect to mortality and readmission, and at least not worse. I then joined them. So if you can't beat them, join them. So I joined the group and I said, we should be looking at lifetime earnings, because $20,000 isn't really motivating. And even when you get a salary bump, what about all the years that you missed out? And so we actually did another study that made it into Health Affairs, looking at the $2 million gap, which again made it into the New York Times. But you really don't make it in a career in medicine until you're spoofed on SNL. And so here I was watching SNL, and Michael Shea from Weekend Update actually was like, female doctors make $2 million less. And then the punchline he said later was, female doctors? And so highlighting that in 2022, indeed, the term female and doctors still doesn't resonate with the public. And so we have a long way to go. So what did I do after that, after, sort of accidentally falling into this? Well, certainly we did a lot of work on medical education. And so looking at emergency medicine training, we looked at milestones assessments, and we saw that in the blue lines, men and women start out being assessed mostly the same. But by the time they're third-year residents, there was a big difference between how men and women were assessed in residency. Particularly the men were outperforming the women. And why was that? And so oftentimes you have to look at the qualitative data. And the qualitative of data showed that when female residents struggled, they received discordant feedback on autonomy and assertiveness. And when male residents struggled, they received coaching. And so this is really important because as women are taking their first leadership position in a residency, either running a code or doing a procedure, they're often actually going against those agentic masculine traits known as for team leadership, and they're paying penalties for it. And so what can we do about this is the question. I also obviously use social media a lot. I'm not the only one. I'm here with Bob, obviously. And so I did another paper with a team to say, is social media this great equalizing force? And interestingly, despite male and female physicians both saying they use social media for collaborations and professional opportunities, women were less likely to report social media use expanded their research or led to a speaking engagement or a scholarly opportunity. So now enter the pandemic, and I want to just highlight that, of course, the pandemic has had a major impact on women, the She Session, many job losses, furloughs, especially from historically marginalized groups. And the key here is that women physicians are not spared. And so this is my friend in Illinois, Sheetal Rao, who's a physician who actually quit her job to take care of her 2 small children during the pandemic, and she is married to another physician. So it's not so that, a high salary or so can actually buffer you from this problem, especially with caregiving. No talk around gender equity in medicine would be complete without citing Reshma Jagsi, who's a physician at University of Michigan and has done a pioneering work looking at this. And she actually also looked at first author papers and senior author papers and any author papers in COVID-19, and she found a big disparity. And so not surprisingly, not only were women falling out of the workforce, but even if you were in the workforce, you were going to have difficulty getting your research published because you were probably doing caregiving. And so how can you level the playing field for productivity? And so this is where bridge funding is especially important. And so I'm pleased that many institutions, through the support of the Doris Duke Foundation and Walder Foundation and others, including UCSF and now University of Chicago, have received the COVID-19 fund to retain clinical scientists, to provide extra hands funding to retain these scientists. But in addition, we've got to also think about promotion and tenure. So I serve on the promotions committee, and there's always this discussion of clock adjustments, especially around parental leave. And ironically, you may not be aware that parental leave clock adjustments actually favor men over women. And so if not designed well, something to actually help equalize gender equity could exacerbate it. Clock adjustments also lead to promotion delays, and so that's a challenge. And so one possibility is a benchmark adjustment, and I'll talk about that in a second. And so benchmark adjustments could actually help examine trajectories before and after life events like birth of a child. And why is that important? Well, in many conversations in promotion committees, there's always this discussion that goes like this. Why is there a gap on this person's CV? It's usually a woman. And I see that for X number of years, 3 years, there was no paper and no grant. And then somebody from the back of the room, smoke-filled room will say, oh, that's because they had a baby. And so it's like, why is that not just transparent so people can understand that in fact, they were actually not in the workforce at that time? We also have to recognize and reward team science and novel contributions, particularly for caregivers, because we have to normalize that care is occurring. This has been incredibly important during Zoom, and something that I've been very sensitive to as somebody who had a baby actually at the beginning of the pandemic, especially for women and people from minoritized communities. So this is not just a gender issue. We all know that people who are more affected by the pandemic have been doing and taxed with more issues around vaccination efforts, counting misinformation, advising schools and community groups. And how do we get all of that to really count? And so working with Dr. Charlie Ray, who's one of the faculty at UCSF, as well as a variety of other individuals, we've started to conceptualize, could we be using the CV and revising promotions criteria to account for these novel contributions, so that if you were pulled into, I was just in a conversation for promotion today, to be like, this person actually flipped us all into telehealth. How can that not count for a promotion? That was such a big deal. how is it that it can be more than just the peer-reviewed publication, but all of the work that you're doing, as well as accounting for disruptions? Because what if there's nobody in the room to advocate to say, oh, that person had a child, or oh, that person was getting chemotherapy, or oh, that person was dealing with IVF? So in closing, I just want to recognize many of the work at University of Chicago, led by a variety of individuals on our Women's Committee and what we've been doing. One of the things we recognized was it was need to recognize women, especially for awards. And so concerted impact and effort to actually write for women for awards. And I've been the recipient of this. The committee just emails you and says, hey, you're going to be put up for the award. And that this is really important because sometimes you don't think of yourself for the award. Similarly, self-promotion. It's not very common for women to consider self-promotion. So rather than self-promote, can a small group of women agree that when one of you gets an honor or recognition, that somebody else in your group would actually email your section chief or your division chief or your chair to say, hey, look what happened to my friend. And that oftentimes reduces the burden on the person. Make women seen. And so this is actually our prominent wall of women. And, we obviously have the prominent wall of men in all of our auditoriums because all of our chairs have been men. But we realized we do have women. We have women who have been a MacArthur Genius Award or a provost, or who have won a Lasker Foundation Award, a Presidential Medal of Freedom. How come we're not recognizing that? Why is this important? Well, the first day this happened, they debuted this. I went to go take a picture of this wall, and one of our environmental services workers, who's also female, was taking a picture of the wall, and she was excited for the same reason I was, because she was going to go home and show her daughter that you too can make this. Sponsor women. And so I think of this great tradition, obviously, at UCSF and many others. And actually, my good friend here, Dr. Andy Auerbach, is pictured. This is the induction into ASCI, American Society of Clinical Investigation, where both Dr. Jagsy and I were fortunate to be sponsored by Dr. Sanjay Saint, who actually was, a big primary driver of both of us getting into ASCI. And so I wanted to highlight that these things are really critical. And so anytime you try to lift somebody up, think about whether or not you're lifting up somebody who actually hadn't thought about it for themselves. Lastly, make it safe for women. I don't need to tell you that, one of the big challenges with, gender equity is also thinking about things like gender harassment. And this is the classic iceberg model, not of patient safety, but of gender harassment. And it highlights that we oftentimes in these jobs as deans and chairs, we only get the call from Title IX when something horrible happens. But when those things happen at the very top of that iceberg, you can be sure that below that public consciousness, there is a climate that's hostile for women, that's including gender harassment, and it could be just these microaggressions. And so that's why it's really important to call out things so that you don't let this climate perseverate. And then lastly, we can create women leaders, but we have to like women who lead. Many times women who are put into leadership positions are put in at times of great turnaround, like myself. We have to evolve our curriculum, pandemic. And one of the challenges there is you can fall off the glass cliff where you're more likely to fail because you're probably put in a high risk setting. The other thing that's often discussed is that success and likability are positively correlated for men, but negatively correlated for women. When a woman is successful, people of both genders like her less. And this is particularly important given those studies that I was telling you about evaluation, especially when women are in team leader roles. So I want to just end by saying, COVID has unmasked what we need to fix. So we have a lot of work to do. And then lastly, I would be remiss if I did not point out in a climate that we're in, that we will not have true gender equity until we have freedom of gender identity and expression for all. And so while I'm not here discussing that, I did want to highlight that this is something we do need to fight for. So with that, I will stop sharing my screen and turn it over to Dr. Sarkar.
Great. Thank you, Vinny. That was terrific. We have plenty of questions, but we'll get to them at the end. So, Rumala, why don't you come on?
Hi, everyone. It's such a pleasure to be here and to follow that wonderful talk. There's my brief roadmap. I want to start by acknowledging my foremothers. Rebecca Lee Crumpler was the first African-American woman to become a physician in 1864. And the other pictured women are Anandibai Joshi from India, Keiko Okami from Japan, and Sabat Islambuli from Syria, who are the first women from their respective countries to get medical degrees. So before I jump into it, I want to just start out by acknowledging, just in the same way that Dr. Aurora acknowledged that gender is not a binary, but we're sort of having to talk about it that way today because of the limitations of the studies that we're sharing with you. I want to also acknowledge intersectionality. Barriers are much more for women of color, particularly those from historically excluded populations. And I'm demonstrating that with some data, which is from the American Association of Medical Colleges. These circles represent all of the women working as faculty in academic medicine. So they're all women. And the purple is white women. So as you can see, as people advance in careers, the proportion of women in academia who are women of color goes down. I can't say a lot about that with the data that we have, but I want to say that is the backdrop. And when we think about interventions, we must always think about intersectionality. Okay, I usually, when I give this talk about gender equity, I don't usually talk about my own journey, but Dr. Aurora inspired me to be a little bit more personal. So I spent my entire career in this department, and it has always been as part of a two-career household. My husband, Ted Omachi, and I met in medical school, and we matched here at UCSF for categorical residency. We had our children early in our career when we were both fellows. And I was raised a feminist, but I became passionate about gender equity actually during my training. When my husband and I were students, I didn't feel much of a difference in the way we were treated. But when he and I started internship, it really opened my eyes. I saw patients, family members, nurses and other staff, consultants, and even attendings treat him differently than they treated me. And these differences widened when we became parents on similar trajectories early in our career. It really made me realize how much we have left to do to get to an equitable society. And with that said, let's get into it. Okay, so I want to talk about implicit bias for a minute. And Dr. Aurora alluded to gender differences in how we perceive residents. We did a study that was led at UCSF, but incorporating data from multiple medical schools, where we evaluated narrative evaluations of third-year medical students. And without belaboring it, I just want to show you, when you look at evaluations for female students who received honors, some of the unique words that you see for these women students: enthusiastic, lovely, poised, cheerful. And in contrast, when you look at words that are uniquely in male evaluations, among the honors evaluations, you're seeing great, technical, professional, surgical. And these words do not have a similar flavor. Okay. Another example of implicit bias is when this group of scientists randomized people to evaluate a CV, and they randomized it to have a male name versus a female name at the top. It received higher scores when there was a male name at the top. Moving over to real life, in assessments of general internal medicine faculty, women are scored lower by learners compared to male faculty. When we think about science, teams that are disproportionately men authors systematically undercite papers. This particular study was done looking at the top 5 journals in neuroscience and looking at male-male, male-female, or female-female teams, and seeing that all male teams disproportionately undercite all female papers. Okay, an important point that goes along with what Dr. Aurora said about self-promotion and social media and the accruing of attention from work, there's a metric called the ALT metric that is a sort of a synthesis of how much attention people's scientific work gets. In this study, which looks just at the 100 most the studies that got the 100 most public attention in that year, we can see that the studies that were authored by women had fewer citations in line with the prior study that I showed you, and fewer mentions in blogs, which is really a combination of interest from journalists and peers. So that then makes a sort of a self-reinforcing effect, just the same way that Dr. Arora talked about how she was in the New York Times, and that then led her to become known as an expert in this field and actually expand her work in it. Those opportunities are actually disproportionately accruing to men. Okay, so let's keep marching on. There is an opportunity and sponsorship gap, and sometimes it feels like men walk through the door and women have to climb up a whole bunch of stairs. So men do not make referrals to women specialists. This is an article from the American Journal of Medical Economics. And while I won't belabor this figure, I'll tell you the blue circles represent the behavior of male referring physicians. And because they are above the dotted line, they are disproportionately referring to male subspecialists. The behavior of women physicians is in red plus signs, and you can see that the women physicians refer more to women colleagues, but everybody disproportionately refers to male specialists. And this comes from Medicare data across the country. Okay. Other opportunity gaps for women in academic medicine. This study that looked at a couple of different junior centers and junior investigators showed an average startup fund for men that was twice as much as the average startup fund for women. Now, I am sure that the data about achieving NIH grants is somewhat familiar to this audience. Men are more likely to get NIH grants on their first submission compared to women. Even more pernicious, in my opinion, is what happens after you get a grant. So award sizes, typically there's a stage where the dollar amount of your award is reduced after it is funded because of across the board cuts. But this is a place where there's a lot of discretion. And it turns out that women's grants are cut more than men's. So even after you receive a grant, if you have less funding to do the work, that puts you farther behind. It's not surprising that there continue to be disparities in promotion, both to associate professor, full professor, and department chair. This study was a repeat of a very famous 1998 study and showed that these disparities in promotion for women continue to persist in academic medicine. Okay, so once you clear that bar and you've made it to full professor, presumably you're not facing disparities anymore, except you kind of are. Even among full professors, women are less likely to hold endowed chairs than their male counterparts, and these persistent gender differences are present even once you adjust for all of these. In this table, you can see all of these adjustments for scholarly performance and particular field, etc. Okay, I don't know if this face is familiar to all of you, but this is William Osler, who's often called the father of modern medicine. He famously stated that there are three classes of human beings: men, women, and women physicians. He was deeply suspicious of women physicians and considered them to be unnatural. He refused to support expansion of existing medical colleges for women, founding of more, and inclusion of women in medical school classes with men. And I put this up to remind us that where we are now didn't happen by accident. Okay. So thinking about these structural barriers beyond the world of work, this slide is actually from Dr. Reshma Jagsi, who Dr. Arora mentioned is a real pioneer in this field. And she did a study of physician researchers where she compared the amount of domestic work that people were doing. And women physician researchers spent 8.5 hours more per week on domestic activities compared to their male peers. Moreover, women physician researchers who had spouses who were employed full-time were much more likely to take time off during disruptions of usual childcare. This is pre-pandemic, and I feel like the entire last 2 years has been a disruption of usual childcare. And when I look at our early career physician researcher faculty, I can see the impact of being the one who is in charge of these disruptions. Okay, I alluded earlier to becoming a parent when I was still a trainee. And it is a very prevalent feeling among women in medicine to face discrimination after becoming a parent. So typical challenges that mothers in medicine face include disrespectful treatment by nursing or support staff, not being included in administrative decision-making, and lower pay or benefits. And then you can see one additional bar on this graph is being held to a higher standard of performance. Okay, so I think I probably have depressed you, and I'm sorry about that, but solutions do exist. It is really critical when we're thinking about how people are moving through advancement, promotion, and leadership roles to think about our processes. Women advance more equitably when there are pre-specified qualifications for a position, when there are concerted efforts to encourage women applicants, when interviews are standardized, and when search committees are diverse and have oversight. There are also solutions for these gender-specific constraints that may be outside the workforce. Things like paid maternity leave, backup childcare, lactation support, schedule flexibility have all been cited by women in medicine as working conditions that would enhance equity. And then finally, it's important to think about how we can align incentives across work duties to compensate the work that women perform disproportionately. Dr. Arora alluded to the better clinical outcomes that women physicians consistently have demonstrated. The differences are small, but they're present across settings. There's also well-documented increased time with patients, more complete documentation, and increased responsiveness to patient calls or messages. Similarly, in academic work, women spend more time teaching and mentoring and more time in service. In our current system, these activities are not compensated financially, and that is something that can change. Finally, we can think about reframing implicit bias. I invite you to go to this website, catalyst.org bias correct, and put in an adjective that might be pejorative that's been used to describe you, and think about how, or a woman you love, and think about how it can be reframed in a way that supports their contribution in the world. And I chose persuasive because I hope I've persuaded you that gender equities remains a burning platform in academic medicine and one in which we all have a role to play. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Urmimala. That was quite persuasive. Thank you. Appreciate it. Diane.
Thank you. So I appreciate being here today to talk to you about the organizational approach to gender equity at UCSF. So we've heard a lot of background about the evidence and what we know in the literature about this problem. And it does raise the question, what is happening in our own organization that might help us? I want to give attribution and credit to a number of people who have worked with me over the last couple of months to put together some of the highlights that I'll be sharing here today. It is their leadership and a lot of their work that has gone into making a lot of the efforts possible. And I'm going to start with what I think is one of the most important things an organization can do to really focus on improving equity, and that is to measure and then to be transparent in that measurement. And I will say that in my observations, I feel that we have demonstrated this well at UCSF, and I'll show you a few examples of what we know from that data. So this data, which comes from the UCSF Faculty Climate Survey in 2017 and was presented by Brian Aldridge in a recent town hall we did for International Women's Day, is really showing the difference between who perceptions of who receives preferential treatment between women and men perspectives. And what you'll see is that women see a very strong difference in preferential treatment in things like salary and compensation, leadership opportunities, promotion, et cetera. But even men can see those differences, which is also sort of interesting. And then the only exception here is for flexibility of family, where you don't see that increased preferential treatment perceived for men. When we look at our physician data, so this comes from our annual Net Promoter Survey data, for which we have health systems represented of UCSF Health, BCH, the children's hospitals, including Oakland, and ZSFG. We see that when people are asked to rate how likely are they to recommend UCSF as a place to work, there is a gap between male and female genders between 15 and 21 points at UCSF Health West Bay over the years 2016 to 19, and a slight improvement down to a gap of 10 back in fiscal year 21 in our last survey. Similar patterns seen at ZSFG and a flipped pattern at BCH Oakland. We also see this gap for burnout between males and females, and we also see this pattern at the GME level. So what do we know about our pipeline for leaders and female faculty across our organization? For all faculty across all schools, 49% are now female. And as you go up in the ranks to higher levels of leadership, that drops off to 40% at the dean's level. If we look at School of Medicine specifically, there is a more steep drop off, specifically noting the department chair's data here at 22% female. I will say that when this was presented, and this data comes from the Office of Faculty and Academic Affairs and is from October of 21, Elizabeth Ozer, who presented this data at our town hall, did point out that this shift from associate to full professors is now 14% difference, whereas over the last decade, it was more like 20% difference. So seeing some improvement in promotion to professor level. You may ask yourself, what do we know about time to promotion by gender? And this data suggests that the time to get promoted from both associate to full and from assistant to associate do not show that, that there's a difference where it takes longer. And in fact, men take slightly longer to advance compared to women at the assistant to associate. I also want to bring your attention to the School of Medicine, UCSF School of Medicine's diversity data stories, which can be found at the link here and also the Faculty Academic Affairs website, both of which have a lot more detailed demographic data and more detail about what's happened over the last 5 years as leadership positions have been turning over to show again what we know about our data. I want to turn now just to share a bit about Department of Medicine specific data. And this, the next couple of slides refer to the Net Promoter Scores in clinical and overall work by department. So the Department of Medicine does have a 14-point Net Promoter Score gap where females score lower than males in how they feel about UCSF as a place to work. And same is seen for clinical and overall work. We also see that burnout by gender identity in the department shows a 6 and 10 point gap when we look at burnout using 2 different scales that are validated and well published, the Maslow and the Mini-Z inventories. And then I think I'll conclude that piece just by saying that we have a lot of information and a lot of information that has been tracked over time. And what that allows us to do is then to really prioritize this as a goal for us as an organization. There are many ways in which this is being prioritized, but I'll highlight this example in my role, which is that we have named the gender gap in Net Promoter Scores as a true north goal for the health system. And that has been true for the last few years. So our goal for this upcoming survey is to see a decrease in that gap from 10 to 5 and ultimately, aspirationally, to eliminate that gap altogether. I want to move to something that I think once we have measured and once we have prioritized this is the next important step, which is monitoring and accountability. So how do we know that people are working on this across the organization? And this isn't just a few people who care. And one of the ways we know is through holding an annual faculty salary equity review. So we heard about differences in salary between genders. What we have up on the Academic Affairs website is the year-over-year results for this. And the conclusions of that data between 2015 and 19 resulted in a total of $1.95 million in salary adjustments due to gender differences. But we know that there's also more than what is obvious. Some of the drivers that are being named for these salary imbalances are specialty and subspecialty differences in market competitive compensation and the recognition that there is a predominance of women in lower paying specialties, and also leadership roles and who is given opportunity for leadership roles. Based on the faculty salary equity review data, there have been a number of recommendations made to departments to help and make sure that departments are going beyond what is obvious. So examples of that include that we should not be relying only on statistical significance if the N is small, but that matched pairs can be looked at to really further look at salary imbalances. Another example is making sure that how comp plans negotiate the Y and Z salaries, which are more incentive based, is transparent, and that people have equal opportunity to access those kinds of opportunities. In the School of Medicine, there have been a couple of accountability interventions, or a couple buckets of accountability interventions, and those are in how departments go through a diversity accountability process and how we assure committee composition has representation from women and underrepresented minorities. So I will be talking about some of the work that's come out of the School of Medicine, and these slides came from Julianne Sosa, who takes a leadership role in the Chairs and Directors Council on Diversity, and also Stephanie Belger from the School of Medicine Dean's Office. And what that group has shared is that through the formation of this Chairs and Directors Council on Diversity, an accountability process has been put into place, and this is the 6th year in which we have data. So how accountability is ensured in departments is that there's an annual report of department demographic data that's provided annually. And then each department leader has to create a diversity action plan. The committee reviews that action plan and makes recommendations to the dean. And then the dean meets with each departmental leader and director and assures that there is ongoing effort to improve things like the climate for UIM and women, as well as leadership strategies to make sure that all levels of mid-level leadership, that there are efforts being taken to improve equity by gender and UIM status. There are a number of examples of the impact from this. One that I'll call out is that now 25 of 27 departments have an open call for nominations for leadership positions. Prior, this was only 50 to 80%, depending on the type of leadership position. There are a lot of other, I think, outcomes and best practices that have come from this, but for the sake of time, I'll move forward to say that the work on the committee composition to assure that all committees have 50% women or URM representation has come into place over the last several years. And what we see, which is an association, but not necessarily a causation, is that as the committee structures have changed, we've also seen changes in something like endowed chair appointments, which in fiscal year 15 were majority male, but are now majority female. I also want to call attention to the LEAD project, which is an effort to take what we know we do for external searches and move them internally into internal positions for departments. And this is the group that has taken on this project led by Elizabeth Ozer. The group is working on a leadership toolkit intervention to really apply all of these practices within departments and be able to track data over time. And what that has shown over time in this 1 year in, so again, this is a 2-year project, but work in progress, is that we are seeing movement towards improvement in female representation at levels of leadership, such as division chiefs and vice chairs, as well as residency and fellowship program. And then I'll emphasize that externally searched positions do have very specific protocols for how to ensure equity, including faculty equity advisors signing off and being involved, diversity statements being required. And the LEAD project is creating materials for how to, again, apply these within departments. And these are available on the Office of Diversity and Outreach website. So anyone can access guides step-by-step for selecting faculty for leadership positions, how to limit bias, as well as how to committee member who has personal awareness about bias and is bringing that to the table to committees. A few things maybe to finish off with include pandemic advancement, family support, lactation, and sponsorship considerations. And I want to highlight the committee on the status of women. And this is co-chaired by Laurie Pearson and Narissa Coe, who created best practices for the organization, along with the Office of Diversity and Outreach prior to the pandemic. This group, in addition to all these best practices, has also met with lots of women's groups across campus during the pandemic and has made a report to the Chancellor's Cabinet regarding recommendations to support women from the impact that has happened throughout the pandemic. We've had a number of efforts related to academic advancement to support gender equity, including allowing extension of the 8-year timetable to get from assistant to associate level, making sure that COVID personal statements are encouraged and that women and underrepresented minorities and others can talk about their contributions and challenges related to the pandemic. So caregiving responsibilities, for example, or impact on career, and that holistic review will be taken of those CVs and those advancement packets so that their careers are not stalled out in terms of advancement because of impact of the pandemic. A number of family support structures have been put into place. People are probably familiar with faculty leaves for childbearing and child rearing, increasing to 12 weeks, as well as a new adoption benefit, which launched in July of last year. We have a new child care referral service through Pauline Lee, who helps families navigate childcare and helping them secure that for themselves, and then offering dependent COVID testing through the pandemic. There have been a number of enhancements to Backup Care program, which I think most people are familiar with. Some that may be less familiar includes subsidized virtual tutoring for families. And if you cannot get backup care, they'll reimburse you $100 per day for your own securing of that child care. And then lactation related improvement that has been led by Michelle Murad and Caroline Wick. We have learned a lot about lactation barriers in our organization, and the two of them have really led the charge to do a lot of different things related to lactation, including a tripling in the amount of lactation rooms on site, improving room accessibility, implementing lactation work RVUs, working with UCSF Health for ambulatory physicians, and creating time holds that are available so that women are not pumping across at the edges of their work or kind of going to the bathroom or their car to do these things, and making sure that there's time that's being held and allowed for within a clinical schedule. And then a lot of other work that's happening to just implement department and division specific efforts around this. And then lastly, I want to credit Maya Williams and Veronica Yankovich Feldman, who have created a lot of support around sponsorship. So again, I think there's a sentiment that women are over-mentored and under-sponsored, meaning that if you sponsor women, you're actually helping advance them for opportunities as opposed to simply giving them advice and counsel. And all of this work is in progress, but something I think to look for going forward. And I'll stop by saying that there is often a feeling that our organization is hard to move. And all of these efforts have started with someone saying, I think we could do this differently and do this better. And I'm remembering specifically Michelle Murad coming to me one day and saying, hey, I just had a hallway conversation with Josh Adler about lactation time protection for ambulatory physicians. And now we have a couple of years later, again, these things in place. And I want to encourage people that as you're seeing things, that bringing them up and starting the conversation in an organization that is willing to move on them does make progress. So thank you. Turn it back over to Bob.
Great. Thank you, Diane. That was fabulous. Why don't we bring on all three of you? Thank you for a really rich and important discussion. I know people really appreciate it, as do I. Bunch of questions and issues I want to chat about, and some more coming in as well. Let's talk about the pay gap for a second. Vinny, this is yours, since you're Dr. Pay Gap, or whatever the New York Times called you.
Dr. Pay.
Exactly. We just did an analysis in our department, and there was no pay gap in the core salary that people had. The pay gap basically reflects internal moonlighting, that men were more likely to have, when there are additional shifts to be picked up above your salary, men more likely to pick that up. Is that something we need to address, or is that just a preference that different people have about doing more work beyond sort of their core job description?
That's a great question. It's actually come up here in residency because, as you know, residencies, historically low wages, and many people do supplement their pay with extra service pay or moonlighting opportunities. And one of our female residents pointed out astutely, like Diane mentioned, with the hallway conversation, while I'm not going to have as many moonlighting opportunities, is that fair? Will I be able to afford my prep for this, that, or my job, going out to fly out to look for interviews and things like that? And what I would say is that, whenever we look at whenever you look at a disparity, you have to look at why that is. And so I do think that, of course, many of our institutions, yours and mine together, Bob, rely on that extra service pay to make it. And so that is a challenge, right? We don't have enough people in our workforce to actually be sourced to admit every patient that comes through our hospital. So we use extra service pay. And because we use that, it creates this inequity. And it also creates a lot of burnout. So I would also say many people are moonlighting and, sort of trying to make ends meet, but also are very burned out. And so we probably should be examining that closely. I would say that the fact that you don't have inequity with base pay makes me feel better. In our organization, we really focus on administrative supplements as well, because those also align with leadership positions. And that's also the secret sauce of how people get ahead. And sometimes people don't even know to ask for that with a leadership position. So these are where transparency about all parts of your salary does help.
Great. And maybe one more question for you about the salary thing. I forget who said it, maybe it might have been Diane, that there's a predominance of women in lower paying specialties, and that's why that explains the gap, that in medicine women are more likely to go into primary care or rheumatology and less likely to do invasive cardiology or GI or pulmonary.
Yeah.
Is that a preference, or is that a bias?
So that's not just in medicine. That's the classic, what's called in the literature term, pink ghetto, for nursing, social work, teaching. Even my daughter went on the way to school this week, was like, Mom, you work in a profession that women didn't used to work in. And, that's great. And I was like, what profession is that? And she said, you're a doctor. And then I was like, yeah, and I'm also a dean, So I will say that, that is a challenge, is that we've seen historically low pay for those predominantly female careers. But having said that, let's take a look at OBGYN. And so when a male becomes an OBGYN, they actually make a lot more than a female OBGYN, controlling for all other things. And that's also been shown in nursing. And so for whatever reason, when men enter the workforce, they actually get the benefit in those fields that are predominantly women. So highlighting that there is a bias there. And I guess,
so the question would be, is how to fix that? I mean, you're not going to change that an invasive cardiologist is making more than a
Well, this
geriatrician.
goes back to, I think, well, so two things. One is obviously leveling the playing field for entry. And so are you looking at careers where it's inhospitable for women to enter? And so thinking about, for example, I have medical students matching in surgery next week, and that was unheard of when I was at WashU. So we've made some progress there. And then certainly also thinking about, primary care fields. Many women do go into primary care fields. This is undervalued, right? And so how do we really level that at the level of a policy maker to say this is important? Now, I will say one other interesting thing about this, which is even when you're doing the same work, there was a recent study out of Harvard that showed that women are receiving more in-basket messages and having to answer more in-basket messages than men in a primary care practice. And so really does highlight that, there's something different about the way women work that might actually be a penalty, spending more time with patients, talking with them, answering these questions, making them sort of more approachable. And we have to be rewarding that. And so when we think about moving to a payment system that goes to value, those things could actually become all very positive things about hiring women.
Either of you want to add anything to that?
I'll just chime in a little bit about specialty choice because I do primary care, and a major driver of my decision making. I love primary care. I'm super grateful to my now colleagues, then preceptors in clinic where I still practice. But a major driver of my decision was that I'd been married for 6 years and I really wanted to have a kid. And I was looking at procedural specialties, and I didn't see how, with my husband going into fellowship and me going into fellowship, and it being my biological clock saying it's time to have a baby, I didn't see a path forward. And so even though I am an ambitious person and had a lot of goals for my career, it was a compromise that I felt like I had to make. And I don't want that for the residents now who are going through. I want them to see a path where they can be in a procedural specialty and have a baby at the same time, even if their husband works a lot, or their partner, or even if they don't have a partner. That was just not there for me. And so we can make changes.
Okay. Diane, let me turn to you. And this is a question that came in from one of our viewers. However, an area of major gap seems to be equity at the trainee level, where arguably some of the issues are magnified: parental leave, making childcare more challenging, intense non-family friendly work schedules. Can you comment on the barriers to implementing some of the strides to advance gender equity at the GME level? I don't know if that lives in your world, but I know you've thought about it.
Yes, and I will start by saying that it is a little bit outside of the scope that I work in, and I partner with Larissa Thomas, who is in the Department of Medicine and also leads well-being for the GME level. So I would also direct people to work with her on questions like that. But I do think that training is particularly challenging by nature and history. And I think we've made some progress in how work hours and other things have evolved over time. And so continuing to say, number one, when we're implementing things across the organization, where are the places that these can apply to trainees? So for example, when we put time holds in place for clinical schedules in the ambulatory setting for lactation, those are available for trainees as well as for faculty. My understanding is that because of union negotiations, that leave has also been expanded for trainees, and just asking the question, like, why are things like they are, and do they really have to be this way just because we've done them historically this way? So I would say keep asking those questions. There is a whole set of GME related data that I didn't present here, but has been shared with leadership in the last couple of months, which is similar to the faculty survey and the same questions. And so I think a lot more to come on interventions at that level as well.
Vinny, anything you want to add, since the trainees now are your world?
Yeah, I do want to commend the American Board of Medical Specialties and a coalition for at least standardizing parental leave. And that was the first step. Is you couldn't even deal with, even if you wanted to give parental leave, you might be jeopardizing somebody's end of their residency or board eligibility. So at least it's standardized across all specialties now for 6 weeks. And then also ACGME has put in lactation into its requirements. And so, as you know, many times in training, we get things through accreditation. And so that is actually where we got a lot of, headway with our space people around lactation and got lactation pods everywhere. So I do think there has been increasing attention on this. And so kudos to those groups. Do we need to do more? Yes, especially for the fact that training overlaps with reproductive timelines, and it's very inhospitable, especially in those long careers. Should we be thinking like, Silicon Valley and be more forward thinking around, family planning with our trainees? I think the answer is yes, and that would be really the next steps that we need to take.
I only have time for a couple more. So Diane, I think you spend a fair amount of your life hearing from people about what we should do, and then having to translate that to people that control budgets to make the business case, not the moral and ethical case, but the business case that burnout, for example, differential is harmful to the organization. So how do you make that case?
Great question. With a lot of gentle nudging and a combination of storytelling and data, I would say. I think it's important to recognize that there's a lot of money in our organization and a lot of things that have to be paid for. But when it comes down to what's most important to us, our mission, vision, and values, none of the things that we want to accomplish in patient care can happen if our people are, halfway out the door because they can't sustain their work or are just not well because of the working conditions. And so, as we think about how do we increase access for patient care, for example, we can't do that without people working clinically. And right now, what I'm hearing from people is, they really want to cut down on their clinical work because the burnout is so high. And, obviously we're in a difficult time now that's more than the usual, but these problems existed before the pandemic. And as we all know, if we actually take care of our people, they will take care of our mission and vision as well, and do it far better than if they are exhausted and struggling themselves. So, I think that's kind of the key message here. But I think it's also important to recognize that there are a lot of things we're trying to accomplish as an organization. And so whenever we decide to direct resources to one place, it often has to come from somewhere else. And we do have difficulty sometimes letting go of things. So that is the challenge.
That's, I think, a great answer. We're a little bit over in time, so I think we probably need to quit. This is a really very, very important and rich discussion. I thank you all for it, and thank you all for your leadership, both locally and nationally, to working hard to make things better. And it's making, we're not there, but it's making a real difference. So really, really do appreciate it. We will see you all next week. Stay safe and well.